On this episode of Criminal Minds, we delve into the tragic story of Kosha Gilmore, a 25-year-old woman whose life was violently cut short while she sat in a car outside her Boston home. What initially appeared to be a random act of violence would soon unravel, revealing a chilling truth rooted in a past obsession, rejection, and a deadly sense of entitlement. As investigators worked tirelessly to understand why Kosha alone was targeted, the answers remained elusive for months. Leads went cold, the case grew quiet, and questions far outnumbered any certainties. But when the truth finally emerged, it illuminated a dark connection from her past, exposing a motive that transformed unrequited feelings into a fatal act. This is Kosha's story. It was meant to be an ordinary night, just a casual conversation in a car before heading inside, but someone was already watching. Within seconds, that quiet moment would transform into something else entirely, a targeted attack. Kosha was not someone living a dangerous life. She was dedicated to her work, making plans, and building a future for herself. Her life offered no warning signs, and perhaps that is what makes her fate so unsettling, as nothing about her existence suggested such a violent end. Kosha Gilmore was 25 years old, a person who put others at ease. She possessed a quiet presence that commanded attention without needing to be loud. Those who knew her described her as kind, compassionate, and genuinely caring. She was non-judgmental, avoiding drama, and navigated the world with a sense of purpose. Her quiet demeanor was memorable. Kosha maintained close ties with her family and cherished strong friendships built on trust, consistency, and deep mutual understanding. She was the person you could call, the one you could always rely on. At 25, her life was still unfolding. She worked as an assistant manager at Radio Shack, establishing financial stability, but her dreams extended far beyond that. Kosha had a creative side. She aspired to become a fashion designer and one day open her own boutique. She had concrete plans for her future, the kind you build step by step, even if they require time. She was also deeply in love, engaged to Mark, and eagerly anticipating a life together. Her focus wasn't solely on her career, she was planning her entire future. There was a palpable sense that things were falling into place for Kosha. Her life had clear direction, unhurried, unchaotic, simply progressing in a way that made perfect sense for her, reflecting the steady pace of building something piece by piece. When considering who she was, her personality, her relationships, her life, nothing suggested danger or a violent end to her story. Kosha was grounded, not living on the edge. She was settled in her daily routine, surrounded by people she knew and trusted, feeling secure and certain about her path, even if every step wasn't yet defined. The people in her life loved her, they were her anchors, the ones with whom she felt safe. There was a quiet certainty in that, a comfort that allowed her to move through the world without constantly looking over her shoulder. On February 19, 2012, that feeling of security was still present, at least at the beginning of the day. Nothing unusual marked that cold winter night in Mattapan, a neighborhood in the southern part of Boston where city life and residential streets gently merge, close enough to the city's energy, yet at times quiet enough to feel removed. Kosha was living there with her fiancé, Mark, and his parents. The day began like any other. Kosha went to work as usual, spending her shift on routine tasks, helping customers, managing the store, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. Nothing about the day stood out, nothing suggested it would be different from any other. When her shift ended, her fiancé picked her up, and they drove home to Mattapan. Upon arrival, they didn't immediately go inside. Instead, they lingered in the car for a few minutes to talk, catch up, and share one of those quiet, in-between moments at the end of the day, the kind you rarely think twice about. The engine was off, the night still around them, it was calm and comfortable. But what Kosha didn't know, what neither of them could have known, was that they were not alone. Someone was already there, watching, waiting. As they sat in the car, unaware, a man began to walk toward them, not running, not hesitating, but walking with clear purpose. He wasn't approaching them both, he was coming for her. Then, without warning, before either could react, the man, dressed entirely in black, walked directly to the passenger side of the car. He came straight to her side, and then gunshots rang out. 2 shots fired at close range struck Kosha. Inside that car, everything shifted in an instant. What had been a quiet conversation just seconds before was now something else entirely. The stillness of that moment vanished, replaced by confusion and fear, by something neither of them had time to process. As quickly as it began, it was over. Mark watched as the man who fired the shots moved away from the car, circling around the back and crossing the street. He didn't run or look back, he simply walked away. In that moment, shock gave way to panic. Mark rushed inside the house, calling for help, trying to comprehend what had just happened as he dialed 112. When police and emergency responders arrived, Kosha was still alive, but barely. She was rushed to the hospital, fighting for her life. Doctors worked to stabilize her, but the damage was extensive. The gunshot wounds had left her gravely injured, and she had slipped into a coma. Back at the scene, officers began to piece together what had transpired. They spoke with her fiancé, but he had little to offer. Everything had happened too fast. He described the man dressed in black and how he had walked up to the car, detailing his movements, but beyond that, there were no clear identifiers. He had no name, no face he could describe in detail, only fragments. However, one detail did stand out. Mark told investigators that just after the shooting, as the man walked away, he thought he heard the sound of a gate opening and then closing. It was a small detail, but in a case with so little to go on at that point, it was something. And so, that was all they had, a woman fighting for her life, a shooter who had vanished, and a scene that, at first glance, made little sense. As investigators processed the scene, they began to notice details that didn't quite add up. Inside the car, Kosha's purse was still there, untouched. Nothing had been taken, nothing disturbed, it didn't appear to be a robbery at all. Then there was something else, even more confusing, because Kosha wasn't alone in that car. Her fiancé had been sitting right beside her, only a short distance away, but he hadn't been shot. She had been targeted. The gun had never been turned in his direction. Investigators had a victim and a witness, yet only one of them had been targeted. As one investigator would later put it, that was the piece that didn't make sense. Why her? Why approach a car with 2 people inside and only target one? This wasn't random, nor was it a robbery, which meant that whoever pulled that trigger came there for a reason, specifically for Kosha. Acting on Mark's detail about hearing a gate open and close, investigators expanded their search beyond the immediate scene, as that detail lingered in their minds. Police began examining the area surrounding the home, trying to determine what kind of gate he could have heard and where the shooter might have gone after leaving. Not far from the scene, there was a cemetery, and it was there that investigators focused their attention. As they searched the grounds, they discovered something that immediately stood out: 2 drawstring bags discarded on the ground. Inside one was a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver with 2 spent rounds still inside. In the other bag, investigators found a water bottle, a pair of latex gloves, and a hat, items that didn't belong there, and more importantly, items that may have been left behind by the person who pulled the trigger. For the first time in the hours since the shooting, investigators were working with more than just questions. They had something physical, something they could test, something they could potentially trace, and possibly something that could lead them directly to the person responsible for Kosha's shooting. The items recovered from the cemetery were carefully collected and sent for testing. Investigators knew what they might be looking at, but knowing and proving are 2 very different things. The gun, the gloves, the hat, even the water bottle, each had the potential to carry something left behind, something invisible yet powerful enough to identify the person who had been there. So, they waited, because DNA doesn't provide immediate answers. It must be processed, compared, and matched, and sometimes that takes time. In the meantime, the case didn't stop, but it didn't move quickly either. With no clear suspect, investigators began looking at the people closest to the victim, starting with Mark. During their conversation with him, Mark admitted that he had once been involved in gang activity in the city. It was part of his past, but something investigators couldn't ignore. They looked into it, trying to determine whether what happened that night could have been connected to that life, whether Kosha had somehow been caught in something meant for him. But as they dug deeper, they found nothing to support that theory. There were no threats, no ongoing conflicts, nothing to suggest it was gang-related. There was also no other reason to believe Mark was involved, no reported issues between him and Kosha, nothing. By all accounts, they were both looking forward to getting married and starting their lives together. This left detectives right back where they started, with a shooting that felt deliberate but remained unexplained. With nothing tying the shooting to Mark or his past, investigators began to examine other areas of Kosha's life. They went to her job, speaking with co-workers at Radio Shack, trying to understand if there had been any recent issues or conflicts that could have followed her outside of work. One situation did surface. At some point prior to the shooting, Kosha had fired an employee after discovering he had been dealing drugs out of the store. It was a serious situation that could have created tension. Investigators did look into him, considering whether the night's events could have been retaliation and if her decision had put her in danger. But that lead didn't hold. They spoke to the former employee, and he was ultimately ruled out. From there, investigators continued working outward, speaking with those who knew Kosha best, her parents, family, and friends. They asked questions and searched for anything that might explain why someone would target her, but nothing immediately stood out. She had no ongoing conflicts and no clear threats, just a growing list of possibilities that led nowhere. In the hours immediately following the shooting, Kosha had still been fighting for her life. At the hospital, she remained unresponsive, surrounded by loved ones. Family and friends gathered, clinging to hope, waiting for any sign that she might pull through. Mark was there too. According to Kosha's mother, they never left her side. He stayed with her through the uncertainty, the waiting, and the dawning reality of what had happened. But despite all efforts, despite everything done to save her, the damage was too severe. The following day, Kosha succumbed to her injuries. Just like that, a case that began with questions transformed into something else entirely, because now investigators weren't just trying to understand what happened, they were trying to find out who killed her. And somewhere in the details they had already gathered, the answer was there, they just didn't know it yet. On February 19, 2012, 25-year-old Kosha Gilmore was shot while sitting in a car with her fiancé outside their home. In the days that followed, investigators struggled to pinpoint a suspect or a motive. In the wake of Kosha's murder, detectives were still trying to piece together exactly what happened that night, and more importantly, why. There had been two people in that car, sitting only a short distance apart, but only one of them had been targeted, only one of them had been shot. And that question, why Kosha, continued to be central to the investigation. Then, about 2 weeks later, investigators received something they had been waiting for, results from the crime lab. DNA recovered from the items found in the cemetery, the bag, the water bottle, the hat, and the gloves, all matched the same unknown male. This was the first real forensic lead in the case, something concrete, directly tied to the evidence they had found. But while it gave investigators a clearer picture of the person they were looking for, it didn't give them a name, at least not yet. Now that they had the DNA, they still needed to match it to someone. With a DNA profile in hand, investigators moved quickly to try to identify its owner. The sample was entered into Cody's and compared against the DNA of known offenders, arrestees, and other evidence from other cases. This was the kind of step that can sometimes turn a case overnight, a direct hit, a name, an answer. But that's not what happened here. There was no match, no record, no immediate connection to anyone already in the system, which meant that the person they were looking for had either never been arrested and had their DNA entered, or simply hadn't been connected to anything else. Just like that, the momentum began to slow. Investigators had something strong, something real, but without a name attached to it, it could only take them so far. So they kept working, revisiting the evidence, re-interviewing people, looking for anyone in Kosha's life who could possibly fit. Because now they knew one thing for certain: whoever killed Kosha had left something behind, they just hadn't figured out who it belonged to yet. In the weeks that followed, investigators continued to work the case, but what they had hoped for never materialized. Nothing they had learned moved the case forward. The DNA profile sat there, promising but unusable without a match. Without new information to connect it to a person, it became just another piece of waiting evidence. Weeks turned into months, and over time, the leads they had began to run out. The theories that once felt possible were ruled out, and the people they had looked into were cleared. Slowly, the case began to stall. There were no arrests, no new developments, no clear direction, just an understanding that the answers they needed wouldn't come easily. Eventually, despite everything that had been done, the case went cold. In the months after the case went cold, there were still no new answers, and Kosha's family was left waiting. Time moved forward without the closure they desperately sought. But time has a way of doing something else, too, a way of bringing things back to the surface, of making people remember details they didn't think mattered. As the one-year anniversary of Kosha's shooting approached, her story was featured on a local news station, Fox 25, as part of their series called New England's Unsolved. For many, it was a reminder of a case that had gone quiet. But for someone close to her, it triggered something. Kosha's stepmother began to think about a man from Kosha's past, someone who had always stood out to her, even back then. His name was Christopher Jackson. She remembered the way he used to come into the salon where Kosha worked as a teenager and sit there watching her, not casually, not the way a friend would. There was something unsettling about it that had never sat right with her, something that made her uncomfortable at the time and even more so now. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that this was something investigators needed to examine. Kosha's mother remembered him, too. Christopher Jackson had been part of Kosha's life for years, someone she had known since middle school. They were friends, he would give her rides, they would talk, they would spend time together like other young people who had grown up around each other often do. But at some point, his feelings had gone beyond friendship, and Kosha didn't feel the same way. She kept their relationship platonic, never allowing it to become anything more. Over time, especially after high school, she began to create distance between them. They didn't see each other as they once had, though they would still cross paths occasionally. At the time, it may not have seemed significant, but now, looking back, it felt like something investigators needed to hear. At that point, investigators had reached a place where any lead, no matter how small, was worth following. Christopher Jackson was no longer just a name from Kosha's past, he was someone who needed to be looked at more closely. So, detectives contacted him and asked him to come in. On February 13, 2013, Christopher Jackson arrived at the Boston Police Headquarters for a formal videotaped interview, and he agreed to speak with investigators without a lawyer present. During that conversation, Jackson downplayed his connection to Kosha. He told detectives that he had known her from school but insisted that there had never been anything more significant than that. According to him, they weren't very close, and he described their relationship as casual and distant, nothing that would stand out. As the interview continued, detectives listened, measuring what he said against everything they had learned. At that point, they knew something that he didn't: they had DNA. So, before Christopher Jackson left the station that day, detectives asked him to provide a sample, and he agreed. A swab was taken from the inside of his cheek, and he was allowed to leave. At that moment, nothing had been confirmed. Christopher Jackson had come across as unassuming, cooperative. Nothing about him immediately raised red flags for detectives, and he had agreed to give his DNA willingly. Detectives began to worry that this might be just another dead end. After Jackson left the station, the sample he provided was sent to the lab for analysis. Investigators now had something they could directly compare to the recovered DNA. But as I said, testing takes time, and in this case, it would take nearly 2 months before detectives would receive the results. So once again, they waited, not knowing that whatever was going to come back from the lab was about to change everything. After nearly 2 months of waiting, the results came back, and the DNA taken from Christopher Jackson matched the DNA found on the items recovered from the cemetery. It was the confirmation investigators had been working toward. The unknown profile they had been holding on to now had a name. With that information, detectives brought Christopher Jackson back in for another interview. On April 5, 2013, he sat down once again at the Boston Police Headquarters. This time, after being advised of his Miranda rights, the conversation was different. Investigators weren't asking broad questions anymore, they were confronting him with evidence. As the interview progressed, his story began to shift. He didn't explicitly say the words, according to detectives, but he admitted to a mistake. He told detectives that he had let his anger overshadow his intelligence. It wasn't a full confession, but it was enough to confirm what the DNA had already shown, that he was responsible for Kosha's murder. Following that interview, investigators obtained a search warrant for Jackson's home. During the search, they found 2 composition notebooks tucked away under his bed. Inside one of them was poetry written by Jackson, much of it centered on Kosha, on his feelings for her, on a version of love that she did not return. As investigators began to piece everything together, a clearer picture started to form, not just of what happened that night, but why. Christopher Jackson hadn't chosen Kosha at random. He had been part of her life for years, someone who had known her since they were young, someone who had stayed close enough to watch her grow, to see where her life was going. But for Kosha, that connection had limits. She saw him as a friend, someone familiar, but someone from her past, nothing more. And that was a line he never seemed to accept. While Kosha moved forward, building her life, forming relationships, getting engaged, Jackson did not. He held on to something that wasn't real, something that only existed from his perspective. What investigators began to understand was that this wasn't just about feelings, it was about fixation, an attachment that had gone beyond friendship and into something more consuming. This wasn't a relationship that ended, it was one that never began. And instead of accepting that, he allowed that rejection to turn into something else, something that grew over time, quietly, until it became anger. And on February 19, 2012, that anger turned into violence. What happened that night wasn't a mistake, it was targeted, because the man who walked up to that car wasn't a stranger. He was someone who believed that he was owed something, and when he didn't get it, he took something instead. More than 3 years after Kosha was killed, the case finally went to trial. In May 2016, Christopher Jackson stood in court to face the charges against him. As prosecutors laid out what they believed had led to Kosha's murder, their argument was clear: this wasn't random, it wasn't a misunderstanding. According to the prosecution, Jackson had become obsessed with Kosha, clinging to feelings she never returned, watching her move forward with her life while he remained fixated on a version of a relationship that never existed. And when she didn't return that interest, when she chose a different path, they argued that he reacted out of jealousy, a jealousy that turned into rage. And that rage, they said, is what led him to walk up to that car and take her life. During the trial, Jackson's defense argued that he suffered from developmental issues that affected his mental capacity. They didn't deny that he had killed her, but they maintained that his diminished ability prevented him from premeditating the murder and that he did not fully understand or control his actions in the way the prosecution suggested. The jury ultimately agreed, at least in part, and so rather than convicting him of first-degree murder, they found Christopher Jackson guilty of the lesser charge of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. While the conviction brought a level of accountability, it also left behind a reality that can be difficult to reconcile, because for Kosha's family, the outcome didn't change what had been taken from them. In the end, while the trial answered the question of who was responsible, it couldn't answer the question that had been there from the very beginning: why? Why a young woman who was simply living her life, building something for herself? Why did she have to lose her life in such a violent, personal way? When you look back at Kosha's story, what stands out isn't just how it ended. It was who she was, a 25-year-old woman with plans, with dreams that were still unfolding, with people who loved her. And all of that taken in a matter of seconds, not by a stranger, not by chance, but by someone who couldn't accept that she didn't want to be with him. And that's the part that lingers, because Kosha didn't do anything wrong. She didn't make a dangerous choice. She didn't put herself in harm's way. She said no. She drew a boundary. And for that, she lost her life. But the people who loved her don't remember her for the way she died. They remember her for the way she lived, for her kindness, for her strength, and for the person that she was becoming. Even now, years later, her story still matters. May Kosha Gilmore rest in peace.